How's it going, lads? Today I'm going to be giving you a rundown of every buff, debuff and crowd control in Gigantic. There's a lot of ways these status effects can affect you in game, and some of them have really unique ways of interacting with each other. So let's get started. Firstly, let's talk about combat. You can tell when you're in combat by the indicator on your UI. When you're in combat, you won't regen health or stamina until you're out of combat. Next is base armor. Armor is a damage reduction, so if a hero has 1 armor, they take 1% less damage. Heroes can have 2 types of base armor, low and high. Heroes with low base armor have 15 armor in the front and 7 in the back. Heroes with high base armor have 25 in the front and around 18 in the back. Here's a graphic showing every hero and what base armor they have. This clip will show you the difference in damage between a low base armor target and a high base armor target. Next is crit chance. Crit chance is gained by hitting targets. The more you hit targets, the higher your crit chance will go. Once you hit a high enough crit chance, you'll start hitting people for critical hits. Critical hits apply 20% extra damage to your attack. You can tell when you're hitting someone for crits by the yellow damage numbers above their head. Next is dodging. When you dodge, you'll dash left, right or backwards and be granted invulnerability frame. This means for a brief period of time, you can't take damage or have any effects applied to you. However, this costs 25 stamina. Next up is a damage boost. This boosts your damage by a percentage listed on an ability or upgrade. You can tell when a damage boost is active by the glowing effect on your hero's weapon. Next, we have Armour Boost. This boosts the amount of armor a hero has. The amount of armor given is stated in the ability or upgrade that grants the armor. There is a soft cap of 50 maximum armor that a hero can have at one time. However, there are special cases where an ability or upgrade can grant a hero more than 50 armor. Armor boosts can also specifically be given to the front armor of a hero. You can tell when your armor's been boosted by the glowing shield effect on your hero. Next, we have damage reduction or resistance. This is very similar to armor boost. However, rather than being listed as an amount of armor, it's given as a percentage of damage reduced. Damage reduction / resistance also has a soft cap of 50, but if an upgrade or ability states it'll go higher, it will. The big thing about it though, is that damage reduction and resistance is not affected by crack or break armor. We'll talk about these more when we get onto the debuffs. Additionally, we have shields. Shields are shown as a light blue portion of your UI HP bar, and for allies and enemies it's shown as a yellow part of their HP bar. Shields are kind of bizarre though, because they absorb 85% of the damage taken into the shield, and 15% of the damage taken goes into your HP. Up next, we've got Degen Resistance. This reduces the effectiveness of any debuffs given to the hero with Degen Resistance. There's not really much to say here, I'll just show you an example with Pakko. Up next, we've got Deflect. This blocks all incoming damage and sends projectiles in the opposite direction. However, it doesn't send them straight back to their source. Now we've got Reflect. Reflect works similarly to Deflect in that it blocks damage and sends projectiles in the opposite direction. However, Reflect sends the projectiles directly back to their source. Now we're on to Immunity. This obviously makes you immune to something, often listed in the ability or upgrade. Most commonly, this is on the Bloody Minded upgrade. This gives immunity to weakness. Okay, so I think Speed Boost is pretty self-explanatory. This boosts your base movement speed, both walking and sprinting, depending on the amount given by the ability or upgrade. You can also see when someone has a speed boost on them by the haste effect that trails behind them. On the Superjump, this increases the jump height for you and your allies. Onto Cleanse and Debuff immunity. Cleanse doesn't have a specific visual effect other than just writing that says Cleanse above their head when it's activated. But Cleanse removes any active debuffs that you or an ally have. Debuff immunity prevents the application of any debuffs onto you or any ally. There's also a swirl effect around the person who has debuff immunity. Onto heals. This heals back lost HP. It can be both in the form of self-healing and from allies and creatures. You can see when someone's being healed by a green glow on their character. Now we're on to stealth. Stealth makes your character temporarily invisible. However, there is a slight shimmer that enemies can still see, so you can be tracked and can still take damage. And for the last of the buffs, we have Focus Gain. This can only be increased by upgrades. Such upgrades include Refocus. This simply increases the amount of focus given upon landing attacks and abilities. Now that we've covered all the buffs, let's move on to debuffs. For the first debuff, we're going to talk about Bleed. Bleed deals a damage over time stated on the ability or upgrade that provides bleed. However, what's important about Bleed is that it ignores all armor the hero has. However, it has a curious property if more than one stack of Bleed is applied at a time. If 2 instances are applied at the same time, it will take 100% of the damage provided by the biggest value of Bleed, and only 10% of the second biggest value provided of Bleed. This clip will explain it better. The next debuff we have is Crack Armour. Crack Armour reduces a player's armour by 10 and deals 10 damage a second. This is for a stated duration, stated in the ability or upgrade. Since Crack Armour reduces the armour a player has, it acts as a global damage buff for anyone on your team. You can tell when someone has Crack Armour by a pink glowing shield effect around them. Now we're on to Break Armour. Break Armour works similarly to Crack Armour. However, it reduces a player's armor by 25 and deals 15 damage a second. This makes Break Armour stronger than Crack Armour. It again acts as a damage buff to your entire team to that target. It can also be shown by a glowing pink shield effect. Now we've got Poison. Poison deals a damage over time effect stated in the ability or upgrade. However, the most important thing about Poison is that when it's applied to a target, they take 50% less healing. This makes Poison amazing for fighting against supports. Now on to Heavy Poison. Similarly to Poison, it deals a damage over time effect stated in the ability or upgrade. However, since it's a stronger version of Poison, it buffs the healing reduced from 50% to 75%. This doesn't necessarily mean the damage will go up either, in most cases it won't. Our next debuff is Weakness. Weakness at a base reduces a target's damage output by 25%. You can tell when someone has weakness applied to them by a purple glowing effect around their weapon. However, there are some cases where an upgrade will allow poison to be increased the longer you attack a single target. In these cases, weakness will go up in intervals of 5. Weakness can also be buffed to go to major weakness. This reduces the target's damage output by 50%, and extreme weakness, which reduces the target's damage output by 60%. Now we're moving on to Shock. Shock applies a damage over time effect for 3 seconds. The unique property about Shock, however, is that at the end of the 3 seconds, it'll deal 3 times the damage of the damage over time effect in a 2 meter area around the target Shock was applied to. Shock can also be upgraded to Major and Massive Shock. This simply increases the damage of the base damage over time effect. Now we're on to Burn. Burn's really simple. It's just a damage over time effect. Up next we've got Freeze. Freeze is a combination of the crowd control slow and the damage over time effect. At a base, Freeze reduces movement speed by 25% and deals a damage over time effect for 3 seconds. Freeze can be buffed to increase the slow and damage over time, all the way up to full Freeze, which reduces the movement speed by 60%. Curse is actually a very interesting one. Curse is the antithesis of debuff immunity. This means it prevents the application of any buffs to your target for the stated duration curse is applied. For our final debuff, we're on to Purged. This is the antithesis of Cleanse. This means it instantly removes all buffs from a target. Unlike Curse, however, buffs can immediately be reapplied. Now that we covered all the buffs and debuffs, let's move on to crowd control. First crowd control we're starting with is Slow. Slow reduces the target's movement speed by 25% for a stated duration. This can be upgraded further to Major Slow, which reduces the target's movement speed by 50% for a stated duration. Now we're on to Cripple. Cripple works very similarly to Slow, reduces the target's movement speed by 40%. It also disables the target's ability to jump. This makes it so they also can't use super jumps. Cripple can actually be applied by all melee characters, by jump attacking someone in the back. Now we're on to Hard Landing. This can only be applied by jumping off of high ground. Once you've landed, it prevents your ability to sprint and jump for a brief period of time. However, with careful timing, you can cancel this with a dodge or an attack. Now we're on to Immobilize. This essentially locks the target in place and prevents all movement. It also interrupts any actions they're performing, which we'll talk about later in the video. After you've been immobilized, you can still attack and use your abilities. Now we're on to Interrupt. This cancels the enemy's current actions. This includes using their weapon and their abilities. This is also vital for power game, as it allows you to cancel a creature collecting an orb, or an enemy summoning a creature. Now we're on to Daze. Daze acts as an interrupt and locks out enemies from using any abilities or their weapons. This is only for a brief period of time stated in the ability or upgrade, but enemies are still able to move while dazed. Now we're on to Stun. This operates similarly to how Daze works. It interrupts and prevents the use of any weapons or abilities when the target's hit for a brief period of time. However, the big difference between Daze and Stun is that Stun does not allow any movement. Now we're on to Pull. Pull also acts as an interrupt and pulls the target to the source of the pull. Next up we have Push. Push, obviously, pushes the target in a horizontal direction. This doesn't act as a full interrupt, however. While it can interrupt the collection of power orbs, enemies can still perform any action while pushed. Our next card control is Knock Up. This knocks targets up into the air. Similarly to Push, it can only interrupt the collection of power circles. Apart from that, affected targets can perform any action. Now we have Launch. Launch sort of acts as a combination of Knock Up and Stun. It again knocks the target into the air. It acts as an interrupt and also prevents any actions from being performed during the duration of the launch. This includes any movement. Now onto a fun one, we've got Polymorph. This card control can only be used by Uncle Sven during his focus. When affected by a polymorph, targets can still move and sprint, but they can't perform any other action. It also applies a minor slow, as they can't move as fast. If targets are directly hit by the projectile, it also interrupts. Penultimately, we have Disable. Disable can only be used by Zenobia during her focus. This prevents targets from performing any action at all. It also prevents them from taking any damage. Essentially, they're put to sleep. The last one isn't really a set card control, but I wanted to put it in because it operates in a really unique way. It doesn't really have a set name, so I'm just going to refer to it as Pakko's Focus. It firstly inflicts full freeze on targets, reducing their movement speed by 60% and dealing 50 damage a second for 2 seconds. It then stuns them for 4 seconds and turns their models into snowmen. It then gives them a temporary shield. If you break the shield, you'll deal a burst of damage and break them out of the snowmen. And there you go. That's every status effect in Gigantic explained. I'm hoping when Gigantic re-releases, I'll be able to pump out more videos at a more consistent rate. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.